The dust hung thick in the air of Redemption Springs on the day Jacob Mercer came to town looking for help. It was one of those late summer afternoons, when the heat pressed down on everything like a heavy hand, making even the horses stand still in their wariness. Jacob had been alone on his ranch for 3 years now, ever since his wife Mary passed from the fever, and the loneliness had carved itself so deep into his bones that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to hear another voice at the breakfast table. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered from years of hard work, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of storm clouds. At 42, he moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned that life could take everything from you in an instant, and so you held what remained with gentle hands. His ranch sat 15 miles outside of town, a modest spread with enough cattle to keep him busy and enough land to make him feel small beneath the endless Montana sky. The orphanage stood at the edge of Redemption Springs, a weather-beaten building that had seen better days. Jacob had heard about it from the pastor, who'd mentioned in passing that they had more children than they could properly care for, more mouths than they could feed. The suggestion had been subtle, planted like a seed, and it had taken root in Jacob's mind over the following weeks. He didn't need help, not really, but the silence of his home had become unbearable, and he thought maybe giving a boy a chance at a better life might fill some of that emptiness. Mrs. Thornton ran the orphanage with an iron fist, wrapped in threadbare compassion. She was a severe woman with gray hair pulled back, so tight it seemed to stretch her face, but her eyes held a kindness that contradicted her stern demeanor. When Jacob explained his purpose, she nodded slowly, as if she'd been expecting him, and led him through the narrow hallways where the smell of lye soap and boiled vegetables hung in the air. The children were gathered in the main room, a sparse space with wooden benches and little else. They looked up at Jacob with a mixture of hope and wariness. These small souls who'd learned too young that adults could disappoint as easily as they could save. Jacob's eyes moved across their faces, looking for something he couldn't quite name, when Mrs. Thornton cleared her throat. "Mr. Mercer, I should tell you about one of our more challenging cases," she said, her voice dropping lower. "We have a girl just turned 16. She's been with us for 5 years now, ever since her father was hanged for cattle rustling and her mother drank herself to death. She's strong, capable, and bright as a new penny, but she's got a spirit that won't be broken." Mrs. Thornton paused, choosing her words carefully. The other families who've come looking, they want someone docile, obedient. They don't want someone who asks questions or speaks her mind. They call her Defiant. Something in those words caught Jacob's attention. He turned to Mrs. Thornton. "I'd like to meet her." Thornton's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. She led him through another doorway to a small courtyard, where a girl sat on a wooden crate, mending a torn shirt with quick, efficient stitches. She didn't look up when they approached, her dark hair falling forward to hide her face. She wore a faded brown dress that had been patched so many times it was hard to tell what the original fabric had been. "Sarah," Mrs. Thornton said firmly, "this is Mr. Mercer. He's here looking for someone to help on his ranch." The girl's hands stilled, but she didn't raise her head. "I'm sure he's looking for a boy," she said quietly, her voice carrying an edge that suggested she'd had this conversation before. "Men always want boys. Someone strong who can rope cattle and break horses." Jacob studied her for a moment, taking in the set of her shoulders, the way she held herself like a coiled spring ready to release. "I can teach someone to rope cattle," he said. "What I need is someone who's not afraid of hard work and who won't run off at the first sign of difficulty. Someone who understands that a ranch is more than just muscle. It's about having the sense to know when a cow's about to calve, or when the weather's turning bad." Sarah looked up then, and Jacob found himself staring into eyes the color of honey, sharp and assessing. There was intelligence there, and pain, and a fierce determination that reminded him of a wild Mustang he'd once tried to gentle. She looked at him like she was measuring his worth, deciding whether his words were genuine or just another empty promise from another adult who'd ultimately disappoint her. "I can work," she said simply. "I can cook, clean, mend, and I'm not afraid of animals. But I won't be beaten, and I won't be treated like property. If those are your intentions, you can leave now and save us both the trouble," Mrs. Thornton gasped.
"Sarah!"
"You cannot speak to a prospective guardian that way." But Jacob held up his hand, and something that might have been respect flickered across his weathered face. "Fair enough," he said. "I lost my wife 3 years ago, and I've been running that ranch alone since then. It's honest work, hard work, but I treat my animals with respect, and I'd expect to treat any human being the same. I need help, and you need a home. Seems like we might be able to help each other, if you're willing." Sarah searched his face for a long moment, looking for the lie, the trap, the hidden cruelty that she'd learned to expect from the world. But all she saw was a tired man with sad eyes who seemed to mean what he said. Slowly, she nodded. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Sarah sat beside Jacob on the wagon seat, her small bundle of possessions clutched in her lap. Jacob didn't try to fill the silence with empty chatter, and she was grateful for that. The landscape rolled past them, endless grassland broken by rocky outcroppings and the occasional stand of pine trees. The sky stretched overhead, vast and blue, and Sarah felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. She'd been confined to that orphanage for so long. The openness of the land felt almost overwhelming. When they finally arrived at the ranch, the sun was beginning to set, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. The house was small but well maintained, a simple wooden structure with a wide porch. There was a barn, a chicken coop, and several corrals where cattle grazed peacefully. It wasn't much, but it was clean and cared for, and Sarah could see the pride Jacob took in his land. He showed her to a small room off the kitchen, sparse but clean, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the eastern pasture. "It was meant to be a nursery," Jacob said quietly, and Sarah heard the weight of loss in his voice. "But it'll serve you well enough, I think. There's fresh linens in the chest, and you can settle in tonight. We'll start your training tomorrow." That first evening was awkward, two strangers navigating around each other in the small space. Jacob heated up some stew from the day before, and they ate in near silence, the scrape of spoons against bowls the only sound. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence, not entirely. It was the silence of two people who'd both learned that words could hurt, and so they held them back, careful and cautious. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Jacob woke Sarah before dawn, and together they'd work through the morning chores. He taught her how to milk the cows, how to collect eggs without startling the hens, how to muck out the stalls and spread fresh hay. He showed her how to check the cattle for signs of illness, how to read the sky for weather changes, how to mend fences and repair tack. Sarah absorbed it all with an intensity that surprised him, asking questions, making notes in a small journal she kept in her pocket. But it was in the kitchen where Sarah truly came alive. She took over the cooking within the first week, and Jacob found himself eating better meals than he'd had in years. She had a gift for making something out of nothing, turning simple ingredients into dishes that actually tasted like something worth savoring. She baked bread that came out golden and perfect, made stews that stuck to your ribs, and even managed to create desserts from their meager supplies that made Jacob close his eyes in appreciation. For her part, Sarah watched Jacob carefully those first few weeks, waiting for the mask to drop, for the kindness to reveal itself as a trap. But it never did. Jacob never raised his voice to her, never lifted his hand in anger. When she made mistakes, as she inevitably did while learning, he corrected her patiently, showing her the right way without making her feel stupid or small. He treated her like a partner, not a servant, and slowly, so slowly she barely noticed it happening, Sarah began to trust him. One evening, about a month after she'd arrived, they were sitting on the porch after supper, watching the stars come out. The air had finally cooled from the day's heat, and there was a pleasant breeze rustling through the grass. Jacob was smoking his pipe, the sweet smell of tobacco drifting between them. "Why did you really bring me here?" Sarah asked suddenly. "You could have chosen any of those boys. They would have been stronger, more useful for the heavy work. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. When I was young, he finally said, my father used to break horses for extra money. He had a reputation for being able to gentle even the wildest Mustang. I watched him work with this one horse, a beautiful black stallion that had been running free for years. Other men had tried to break it using force, using fear. But my father, he took a different approach. He was patient. He was kind. He waited for the horse to choose to trust him. Jacob paused, puffing on his pipe. That horse became the best animal we ever had. Loyal, smart, brave. But it never would have happened if my father had tried to break its spirit instead of earning its trust. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, understanding the story for what it was, a promise and an explanation both. They call me Defiant, she said softly. I know, Jacob replied. But I figure the world's already got plenty of broken people in it. Maybe what we need is more people who refuse to be broken. After that night, something shifted between them. Sarah started to smile more, small flickers of happiness that transformed her face and made Jacob realize just how young she really was. She began to share stories from her childhood, the good memories from before everything fell apart. She talked about her mother's singing, her father's laugh, the small moments of joy that poverty and hardship couldn't quite extinguish. And Jacob, in turn, began to open up about Mary, about the life they'd planned together, about the children they'd hoped to have, about the loneliness that had nearly consumed him. They became a team, working the ranch together with an efficiency that surprised them both. Sarah proved to have a natural way with animals. The horses responded to her gentle touch. The cattle seemed calmer when she was near. Even the barn cat that had been wild and skittish began to follow her around like a loyal dog. She had a gift for reading the land too, noticing things Jacob might have missed, small signs that told a larger story. Winter came hard that year, sweeping down from the north with bitter winds and heavy snow. They were snowed in for nearly 2 weeks in January, and in that close confinement, Sarah and Jacob's bond deepened into something like family. They played cards by the fire, read aloud from Jacob's small collection of books, and talked about everything and nothing. Sarah learned that Jacob had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. Genuine laughter that felt like medicine for her wounded soul. Jacob discovered that Sarah was brilliant, that she'd taught herself to read and write, despite having almost no formal education, that she had dreams of maybe becoming a teacher someday, of helping other children who'd been forgotten by the world. Spring arrived with a fury of green growth and new life. The cattle began calving, and Sarah threw herself into helping with the births, staying up all night with difficult deliveries, feeding the calves whose mothers couldn't nurse them. She had infinite patience with the babies, coaxing them to drink, keeping them warm, celebrating each small victory. Jacob watched her with those newborn calves and felt his heart crack open in a way it hadn't since Mary died. But trouble came in the form of Wade Hutchins, a neighboring rancher who'd been trying to buy Jacob's land for years. Hutchins ran a large operation, and he wanted Jacob's water rights, the creek that ran through the property providing reliable water year-round. He'd made offer after offer, each one rejected, and his patience was wearing thin. Hutchins rode up to the house one afternoon in May with 3 of his men, all of them armed. Jacob was in the far pasture, and Sarah was alone, tending the kitchen garden she'd started. She saw them coming and felt her stomach tighten with fear, but she straightened her back and walked out to meet them, refusing to show weakness. Well, Hutchins said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He was a heavy man with small, mean eyes and hands that looked like they enjoyed causing pain. Mercer finally got himself some help. Didn't know he was in the market for a wife, though she seems a bit young for an old man like him. Sarah felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. Mr. Mercer is my guardian, she said firmly. And he's not here right now, so you'll need to come back another time. Hutchins laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Guardian, is that what they're calling it now? Tell your guardian that my offer stands, but it won't stand forever. This land should be part of my ranch, and one way or another, It will be. Mercer's got no sons to leave it to, no future to speak of. He should sell while he still can. This land isn't for sale, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. And you're trespassing. I suggest you leave. One of Hutchins's men laughed, and Hutchins's face darkened. You got a mouth on you, girl. Someone should teach you to speak respectfully to your betters. My betters wouldn't threaten a young woman when she's alone. Sarah shot back, and she saw Hutchins's hand move toward his belt. That's when Jacob's voice cut through the tension like a knife. I believe the lady asked you to leave my property, Hutchins. Jacob had appeared from around the barn, and he was holding his rifle, not pointed at anyone but held in a way that suggested he knew how to use it and wouldn't hesitate if necessary. His face was calm, but his eyes were hard as flint. Hutchins's hand moved away from his belt, but his smile remained. Just having a friendly conversation, Mercer. Explaining business matters to your little helper here. Sarah is family. Jacob said quietly, each word deliberate. And any disrespect to her is disrespect to me. Now, I'll ask you one more time to get off my land. The two men stared at each other for a long moment, and Sarah held her breath, terrified that violence was about to explode across their peaceful ranch. But finally, Hutchins spat in the dust and wheeled his horse around. You're making a mistake, Mercer. He called over his shoulder. This isn't over. As the men rode away, Sarah felt her legs go weak, and she sat down hard on the porch steps. Jacob came and sat beside her, setting the rifle against the wall. His hand shook slightly as he reached into his pocket for his pipe. Thank you, Sarah said quietly, for what you said. About me being family. Jacob looked at her, and his expression was soft. It's the truth, he said simply. Somewhere along the way, that's what you became. Family. The only family I've got left, and the only family I need. Sarah felt tears spill down her cheeks, and for once she didn't try to hide them. Jacob put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him. This man who had saved her without ever trying to break her, who had given her a home and asked for nothing but honest work in return, who had looked at a defiant girl and seen not a problem to be fixed but a person to be valued. But Hutchins wasn't finished. 2 weeks later, someone cut the fence on the northern pasture, and half their cattle wandered onto Hutchins's land. When Jacob went to retrieve them, Hutchins claimed they were his, that Jacob's brand was a forgery. It took the sheriff coming out to verify the brands before Hutchins grudgingly released the cattle. But the message was clear. Hutchins was going to make their lives difficult until Jacob gave in and sold. Sarah watched Jacob age 10 years in those few months. The stress of constantly defending his land, of watching his back, of worrying about what Hutchins might do next, it wore on him. He slept poorly, ate less, moved through his days with a tension that never quite released. Sarah did what she could, taking on more of the work, keeping the house running smoothly, trying to be a source of calm in the growing storm. One night in July, Sarah couldn't sleep. She got up and found Jacob sitting on the porch in the darkness, staring out at the land he loved. She sat down beside him without speaking, and they listened to the night sounds together. The distant call of an owl, the rustle of wind through grass. I'm thinking of selling, Jacob said finally, his voice heavy with defeat. Maybe Hutchins is right. What's the point of holding on to this place? I've got no sons to pass it to, no legacy to build. Maybe it's time to admit that this dream died with Mary. Sarah felt something fierce rise up in her chest, a protectiveness for this man who had saved her, for this land that had become her home. No, she said firmly. This land is your dream, yes, but it's also your wife's grave, your memories, your life's work. You don't give that up just because some bully wants to take it from you. And as for legacy, she paused, choosing her words carefully. You gave a throwaway girl a home and a future. You taught me that I was worth something, that my spirit wasn't something to be ashamed of but something to be proud of. That's a legacy, Jacob. That matters. Jacob turned to look at her, and in the moonlight she could see the tears on his face. You're not a throwaway girl, he said roughly. You're the best thing that's happened to me in 3 years. You brought this place back to life. You brought me back to life. Sarah took his hand, this tough, weathered hand that had shown her only kindness. "Then we fight," she said. "We don't give up. We protect what's ours." From that night forward, they became vigilant. They took turns watching the property at night, kept the rifle loaded by the door, documented every incident of harassment. Sarah started keeping a detailed journal of Hutchins's actions, dates and times and witnesses when available. She rode into town and spoke with the sheriff, polite but persistent, making sure he understood what was happening. The town began to take notice. The pastor mentioned the situation in his sermon, talking about standing up for what's right and protecting the weak from the powerful. The general store owner started giving Sarah discounts, his way of showing support. Even some of Hutchins's own ranch hands began to look uncomfortable with their boss's tactics. Troubled by the harassment of a man and a young woman just trying to make an honest living. The breaking point came in August. Hutchins and his men showed up at the ranch again, but this time they brought legal papers. Hutchins claimed that the creek that ran through Jacob's property was actually on public land, and therefore Jacob had no water rights. Without the creek, the ranch would be nearly worthless, unable to sustain the cattle. Jacob read the papers with shaking hands, and Sarah saw the defeat settle over him like a shroud. The legal battle would cost more money than they had, and even if they won, the process could take years. Hutchins knew it. He stood there with his cruel smile and waited for Jacob to break. But Sarah's mind was racing. She thought about the old survey maps she'd seen in the county office when she'd filed reports about Hutchins's harassment. She thought about the property deed that Jacob kept in his Bible, the one she'd noticed had detailed descriptions of the land boundaries. And she thought about Mrs. Wilson, the elderly woman who lived on the edge of town, who'd once mentioned that her late husband had been the surveyor who'd mapped most of the ranches in the valley. "We need 3 days," Sarah said suddenly. "Give us 3 days to review these documents and respond. That's only fair." Hutchins frowned, clearly not expecting resistance. "This isn't a negotiation, girl. These are legal documents, and legal documents deserve proper review," Sarah said, her voice steady. 3 days. If you're so certain of your claim, surely you can wait 3 days. Jacob looked at her, confused but trusting, and nodded. 3 days, he agreed. Hutchins sneered but agreed, clearly confident that 3 days or 3 years, the outcome would be the same. As soon as Hutchins and his men rode away, Sarah grabbed her shawl. "I need to go to town," she told Jacob. "Trust me, please." Jacob hitched up the wagon without question, and they rode to town together. Sarah went straight to Mrs. Wilson's house, and the old woman welcomed them in with warm hospitality. Sarah explained the situation, and Mrs. Wilson's face grew stern. "My husband would roll over in his grave," she said firmly. "He was meticulous about his surveys. Hutchins has no claim to that water. I have my husband's original maps and notes. We'll prove it." For 3 days, Sarah worked with Mrs. Wilson, poring over old maps and survey notes, comparing them to Hutchins's legal claim. They found discrepancies, errors in Hutchins's documents that proved he'd tried to redraw the boundaries to suit his purposes. Sarah documented everything, cross-referencing multiple sources, building an irrefutable case. On the 3rd day, when Hutchins returned with his lawyer, Sarah met them with her own stack of documents. The sheriff was there too, at Sarah's request, along with the pastor and several other town members. Sarah presented her evidence calmly and methodically, showing how Hutchins had falsified his claim, how the original survey clearly placed the creek well within Jacob's property boundaries. Hutchins's lawyer looked at the documents, and Sarah saw the color drain from his face. He pulled Hutchins aside and spoke to him in low, urgent tones. The sheriff examined the papers too, and his expression grew hard. "Mr. Hutchins," the sheriff said slowly, "filing false legal documents is a serious crime. And this evidence suggests that's exactly what you've done." For the first time since Sarah had met him, Hutchins looked uncertain, even afraid. His bluster evaporated, and he seemed to shrink before their eyes. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said quickly. "My surveyor must have made an error. I'll withdraw the claim." "You'll do more than that," the sheriff said firmly. You'll cease all harassment of Mr. Mercer and Miss Sarah. You'll repair the fence your men cut. And you'll consider yourself lucky if Mr. Mercer doesn't press charges for all the trouble you've caused." Hutchins looked like he wanted to argue, but the expressions on the faces around him made it clear he had no support, no sympathy. He nodded curtly, climbed on his horse, and rode away, his men following silently behind him. When they were gone, Jacob turned to Sarah with wonder in his eyes. "How did you do that?" he asked softly. Sarah smiled, a real smile that lit up her whole face. "You taught me to pay attention," she said. "To notice things, to be thorough, to not give up when things get hard. You taught me that my mind was worth something. I just used what you gave me." The pastor clapped Jacob on the shoulder. "You've raised a remarkable young woman there, Jacob. This town could use more people with her courage and intelligence." Jacob looked at Sarah, and she saw love in his eyes, the kind of love a father has for a daughter, pride mixed with protectiveness and deep affection. "She raised herself," he said quietly. "I just gave her the space to grow." As they rode back to the ranch that evening, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Sarah felt something she'd never quite felt before: peace, belonging, home. The defiant girl who'd once sat in an orphanage courtyard, certain that the world had nothing good to offer her, had found something precious, a place where she was valued not despite her spirit, but because of it. That night, as they sat on the porch after supper, Jacob cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about the future, about what happens to this place when I'm gone. I'm going to talk to a lawyer about making it official, about adopting you properly. This land should be yours, Sarah. You've fought for it, worked for it, made it into something better than it was. It should be your legacy too." Sarah felt tears stream down her face, and she didn't bother wiping them away. "I'd be honored," she whispered, "to be your daughter, to carry on what you've built." Jacob pulled her into a hug, and Sarah wrapped her arms around this man who had looked at a defiant girl and seen potential, who had given her not just a home but a purpose, who had taught her that strength didn't have to mean hardness, that kindness wasn't weakness, that family was something you chose as much as something you were born into. The years that followed were good ones. Sarah did become a teacher, riding into town 3 days a week to teach the children of Redemption Springs, but she always came home to the ranch, to Jacob, to the land that had become as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. She taught the children that being smart was something to be proud of, that asking questions wasn't defiance but curiosity, that their spirits were precious things to be guarded and nurtured. Jacob's hair turned white, and his movements became slower, but his eyes remained sharp, and his love for Sarah never wavered. He watched her grow into a strong, confident woman who commanded respect wherever she went, who stood up for what was right without apology, who had taken all the pain of her early years and transformed it into compassion for others. When Jacob finally passed, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 67, Sarah held his hand and thanked him for seeing her, really seeing her, when the rest of the world had looked away. She buried him next to Mary, and she knew somehow that Mary would have been proud of the family they'd created, unconventional though it was. Sarah ran the ranch for many years after that, and she never forgot the lessons Jacob had taught her. She took in other forgotten children, other defiant souls who needed someone to believe in them. She showed them that their fire was a gift, that their refusal to be broken was a strength, that they deserved to be loved not in spite of who they were, but because of it. And on quiet evenings, when she sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the land she and Jacob had protected together, Sarah would remember that day in the orphanage courtyard, when a lonely rancher had looked at a defiant girl and decided she was worth saving. She would remember how he'd saved her without ever trying to change her, how he'd given her roots while teaching her to fly, how he'd shown her that love didn't have to hurt, that home wasn't just a place but a feeling, that family was built not just on blood, but on choice and commitment and the daily decision to show up for each other. The town of Redemption Springs never forgot Sarah Mercer, the defiant girl who'd become the heart of their community. The woman who'd taught them all that sometimes the things we call weakness are actually our greatest strengths. That sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who change everything. That sometimes all it takes to transform a life is one person willing to see past the labels and look at the soul underneath. And in the end, that lonely rancher and that defiant girl had given each other the greatest gift of all. They'd given each other a reason to believe that love still existed in the world, that redemption was possible, that even the most wounded hearts could heal if given the right home to heal in. They'd proven that family wasn't about perfection or conformity, but about acceptance and respect, and the willingness to fight for each other. When the world tried to tear you down, it was a legacy worth leaving, a story worth telling, a life worth living.